Here we are again. Well, let's start out here by looking at our Constitution of the United States. We've been going through the Catechism of Stansbury's Catechism of the Constitution. And I think we're up to question about, 217, yeah. Thank you, Miss Francine. And Exodus 21:22. Question 217. It says this. This is referring to our Constitution of the United States. What is a reprieve? What is a reprieve? A reprieve is when a person has been tried, found guilty, and condemned to be punished on a certain day. A reprieve is putting off the punishment to some other time. Reprieve is putting off the punishment to some other time when a person has been condemned to be guilty. That's question 217. Question 218. What is a pardon? A pardon is the delivering of a condemned person from the punishment of his offense. A reprieve only delays punishment. A pardon prevents it entirely. A reprieve only delays punishment. A pardon prevents punishment entirely. Question 219. May the President do this in all cases of offenses against the United States? Answer: yes, in all cases, except cases of impeachment. Now, questions 217, 218, and 219, all that go together in the sense it's the same fundamental subject. The difference between reprieve, pardon, and impeachment. Doesn't say much about impeachment here, but I'm going to unpack some of these things a little more. Well, maybe a lot more, depending upon how I feel about it after I get into it. The President of the United States is the Chief Executive Officer of the United States. The President of the United States is not the Chief Executive Officer of your state or of any state of the Union. Each state of the Union is sovereign, and the Chief Executive Officer of each state of our Union is the governor of the state. The governor of your state has the power in our common law tradition, and this is all part of our common law tradition, friends. It's in the Constitution, yes, but the reason it's there is because our first fathers, as we call them, the ones that ratified our Constitution of the United States, did so with a common law government in mind. In other words, simply put, our Constitution of the United States, they didn't create that out of whole cloth, and it wasn't a spark of genius, as is almost always said. All they were doing was putting in place what they had fought the war to secure, which was our common law tradition. We call our president, but he has the same powers as a common law king. And the common law king in Anglo-Saxon England is analogous to the king or the president of the United States, the chief executive officer. He's responsible for executing, that is, enforcing the laws of the United States, not the laws of your state. You have a whole different set of sovereignty there in your state. That's the governor's responsibility. In fact, the president of the United States has no authority to enforce the laws of your state. And if you'll watch close, he doesn't do that. Now, there are times, and this is dangerous, and I wish it had never happened during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, he decided that he would obscure the differences between the state and federal sovereignties, the state and federal government. And he did. And what happened when he did that? He became more powerful. The state governors didn't become more powerful. He did. Who has the most power? The President of the United States at his disposal. The President of the United States or the governor of your state? Well, just off the top of your head, what would you say? I suggest you'd probably say that the President of the United States has more power. Indeed, he does. He commands a few million persons, at least probably 4 million persons in his employment and under his command, up to 3 million employees of the federal government. Almost all employees of the federal government work under the direct authority of the President of the United States. Not all, but almost all. Oh, there are some court clerks that work for the Supreme Court justices. There are some court clerks that work for the appellate justices, and there are some court clerks that work for the district court, federal court justices, judges. And then there are some folk that are employed by the Congress of the United States, but not many. Nothing, I say nothing in comparison to the employees that the President of the United States commands. We're talking non-military employees. But even those non-military employees increasingly pack heat. IRS agents, for instance, work for the President of the United States. They are under his command. Now, up until not very recently, they didn't carry guns. They do now, some of them. BLM agents that responsible for management of the Bureau of Land Management, agents responsible for the management of the land that the United States says belongs to them. They now pack heat. Had never done that before. Increasingly, this has happened. Of course, the FBI, there was no FBI until a fellow that was analogous. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. He was analogous to, Himmler. He was analogous to Himmler in Nazi Germany. In what way? Well, Himmler was a ne'er-do-well in the sense that he had tried several businesses, including raising chickens. Him and his wife didn't do well. He wasn't a ne'er-do-well in the sense that he abandoned his family necessarily. He just kept trying to start businesses, never happened. He was a man who wanted to be something he wasn't. Well, that's J. Edgar Hoover. He wanted to be a tough guy. He wasn't. He didn't look like a tough guy. He didn't act like a tough guy, but he had fantasies of being a tough guy. The same way with Himmler. So what Himmler and J. Edgar Hoover did the same thing. They tried to get themselves in a powerful position under a president who had the same attitude they did about the power of government. And then they got money and went about to hire men who resembled the fantasy of what they wanted to be. You say, Brent, you're exaggerating. No, I'm not. Go read the stories about these men. Himmler was the founder of the SS troops. And that gave him an opportunity to form an army of men that were special, that had special loyalty, under special oaths, under special duties of loyalty to the death. They dressed in black uniforms, sharp looking. Boots up to their knees, sharp looking. Went through a whole lot of extra training. They were the elites. Having these elite kind of things in government's always dangerous. And the government will always promote that kind of thing. I remember when I was growing up, of course, Vietnam was raging, and the government promoted the idea of the Green Beret. That's kind of going by the wayside now. Don't talk much about it. The Green Beret even made a movie. One of John Wayne's later movies in 1968, I believe, was called The Green Beret. That has given way now. The Green Beret has given way now to the SEAL teams. They're the elite troops. They're glorified. When government does those kind of things, be very wary. Because what they're doing is building people up in glory and training them to be killers, to be assassins. And there's no place in our common law tradition of freedom for assassins. But that's what they are. That's what the Green Beret were. They were promoted that way. I saw the movie when I was in high school. It just come out. Every year when I was in high school, somehow the school board or the faculty, I don't know who it was, got together and said, well, we need to show a movie to the whole student body. There wasn't that many of us, but all student body, all the studentry. Trying to think of the name of the guy's name that hates the word student, the word or the phrase student body. Strunk, Will Strunk. He was a professor of English composition at Cornell University. He was E.B. White's professor. E.B. White wrote Charlotte's Web. E.B. White's professor. He hated that phrase student body. He said it ought to be studentry. And he tried to start a movement to do that. I kind of agree with him, honestly. But that's off the subject. So I was talking about Himmler. I was talking about Hoover started the FBI. Himmler started the SS Nazi troops. And then we had the Green Beret in America. Now the SEAL teams. I'm not criticizing the SEAL teams, although they've got some serious problems. In past years, and I just read the internet, heroin addiction was a serious problem. It's a culture of assassination. And there's no place in our Constitution of the United States that authorizes the President of the United States to conduct those kind of covert operations. Obama he boasted of how many people he had ordered assassinated. Friends, that's not just wrong. That's not just unlawful. That's sick. That's pervert stuff. A pimp, squeak, long-legged Mac Daddy like Obama, who couldn't fight his way out of a wet paper bag, bragging about how tough he is because he ordered hits on people. What's the difference between that and gangland murders? Nothing. That's Obama. Did Bush engage in it? He's the one that pushed it through. Congress was stupid enough to go along with it. Is it lawful? No, I don't care what Congress says. It's unlawful. There's no place in our Constitution of the United States where anybody is given authority to assassinate anybody. Assassination is not a part of our common law tradition. Never has been. No, when his name Abe Lincoln. Here's a man that's controversial. Now, notice I said controversial. I didn't say there's a nasty man, there's an evil man. I didn't say that. I said he's controversial because there's a lot of folk that want to paint him as an evil man. I've gone to great lengths to study Abraham Lincoln. I've even known people related to him. I even grew up close by where his mother and father are buried at Shiloh Church. I know the environment he lived in. He born in Kentucky, was a little boy in southern southeast Indiana, spent his growing up years in Illinois. I don't know as much as everybody, but I know some. I was close associates with a fellow who was a Lincoln presenter. He was a friend. He's gone now. He looked like Abraham Lincoln. So he'd dress up in a top hat and a suit, and he was professor of rhetoric. He was a rhetoric professor. That's a true story. One time, rhetoric professor at New York University. He was from where I'm from, and then a rhetoric professor back around in our neck of the woods. He spent the last 30 years of his life traveling about the country, putting on presentations of Abraham Lincoln. He had memorized every recorded speech Abe Lincoln ever made. I know that sounds unbelievable, but I watched him make a presentation one time for 3 hours, and he didn't say anything but what Abe Lincoln said, and he'd memorized it all. Well, I'm just trying to make the point. Now, this guy, his name was Burl, B-U-R-L, McLaren. Burl McLaren. And every day for years, he read at least one book about Abraham Lincoln. Well, I got to know him real well. Matter of fact, we got pretty tight, and his wife, Dorothy, showed my girls how to bake. She was a pretty good baker, and she wouldn't bake. Listen to this. She wouldn't bake on anything but a wood stove and in a wood stove. I helped them unload. They ordered one of those it was a great big iron stove they got back east in Vermont someplace, shipped it in. It was, of course, a 3 or 4 man job to unload it. And they stuck it out in the big room they had on the side of their house where the heat could be confined, and that's where she did her baking, and she never stopped. And always said wood will make better bacon. Not bacon as in meat, but I mean to bake a cake or bake a pie. And boy, could she bake the pies. And Burl had an orchard out there, and he produced, I don't mean little, I mean thousands of pounds of fruit every year. And the squash, what's the name of those things? All different kind of squash. And so she liked to cook, so I liked to go to her house, and boy, could she cook. Well, Burl could talk like that. He knew, no question. Burl knew more about, where we called him Mac. Most people called him Mac, but he knew more about Abe Lincoln than any living man. And there have been men that claim to know a lot, like Carl Sandburg. I don't know he wrote volumes about Abe Lincoln, but I don't know if he knew as much as Burl did. Well, Lincoln was a man, like any president, trapped in the middle. He was a Southerner by birth, a Southerner by culture. And when he left, his family left Kentucky, where he was born, went to southeast Indiana at Pigeon Creek. He never went to school but 1 year. And in the school where he went, the teacher only had one book. None of the children had any books. They called it the Blab School down there in Pigeon Creek because no windows, just had cowhide on the windows, and they'd scrape it off real thin, scrape the hair off, and scrape it off real thin, and put it on the window so the light could come in, but the cold could be kept out in the winter. The teacher had one book. There weren't any books in those days in the wilderness, so I had one book, and the teacher would read the book aloud, and students would repeat the phrases back. I think it was a grammar book or a reading book or something. So he's self-educated. I've heard Southerners talk about how he was queer and he got into a sodomite relationship with a fellow named Speed, Joshua Speed. You can read all that stuff. I don't believe it. People will say anything. He was married, had children, lived in a rough environment. He was rough as nails, looked funny. He was a galoot. He was 6'4". His arms hung down almost to the ground. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And it wasn't like he was a kind of kind of a fellow that you'd have on a poster for selling suits. He looked too unusual, but tough and athletic. And he was the captain of the local militia during the Black Hawk War. And the reason he was captain, because he won a wrestling match with a local ruffian. Trying to remember his name. Don't remember it. They said whoever's the toughest is going to be so they said, Lincoln, you're the big one, but you're awful skinny. But old so-and-so, I can't, dang, it wasn't Carter. But he whooped him, pinned him. And he also always won the crowbar throwing contest. I know some of you hadn't heard of that, but where I come from, crowbar throwing was a big deal when I was growing up. You know, in Scotland, they had what they call those fellows with those big telephone poles. They throw them as far as they can. I forget what they call that. Well, we did that with crowbars. You know, you take a crowbar. My brothers and I used to have contests, and the cousins. You take a crowbar, a big one, about yay long. Well, you can't see my hands, but my usual camera's not there. But the idea is to throw it, and you can't throw it like this, like a javelin. It's just too heavy. You have to pitch it. We have to pitch it in a way that it hits and then lands and then flips over. Abe Lincoln always won those. Always won the wrestling matches. A few other things, but he had an insatiable desire to read, and he just kept reading and reading and reading, and finally he got somebody to back him, and he joined the bar. He became a lawyer. And that's what he did the rest of his life, of course. And that's how he got to be well known, traveling the circuit, because there weren't enough lawyers around. He'd spend most of his time traveling from house to house, courthouse to courthouse, county to county. And then when they'd hold court, he'd be there and pick up business, that kind of thing. But getting back to what we were talking about, assassinations against the law. Himmler was like Hoover. Both of them weren't the men they wanted to be, so they got themselves in a position where they could hire men and be in command of men that were the men that looked and acted like the men they wanted to be. Now, that's the flat truth of the matter. It ought to be said more often. Some people call it a Napoleon complex, and no, Napoleon, I think, was a really pretty sharp military man, although he did things he hadn't ought to do and tried to conquer people he hadn't ought to try to conquer, but he really knew what he was doing. I don't think Hoover or Himmler had a clue what they were doing. They were just living in la-la land and having fun living out their fantasies by being in command of other people. Well, that's not in the Constitution either, any authority to start an FBI or a law enforcement agency like that outside of the U.S. Marshal Service. They were very careful to try to control the power. Well, here we are. The President of the United States controls the FBI, the CIA. They're under his command. They're armed. The BLM agents are armed. Now they're trying to arm IRS agents. If you meet an IRS agent, if he isn't armed, he'll have an armed man with him. That's the way that works. On and on it goes. Well, that's what they were afraid of. They didn't, in our common law tradition, nobody allowed people or in the government to carry guns. They thought that was insane. What? You mean give a gun to a government employee? No way. And they didn't. They didn't. They figured that the militiamen carry the guns, not the government. And they didn't. Isn't that fascinating? Well, at any rate, now we've got all these covert operations. I talked about the Green Berets and the SEAL teams. You know, the SEAL teams were, they didn't start out that way. They were UDT teams, UDT, underwater demolition teams. They were swimmers. And their job was to go in before the Marines got there. You know, the Marines say, we got here first. The UDT teams would get there first. And they would clear the way for the Marines to land. They would destroy the obstacles if there were any in the water, and then they would also secure the beach. But they weren't SEAL teams. They were underwater demolition teams. And then they became UDT SEAL teams. Now, all the SEAL teams are trained as underwater demolition teams. That's true. They're trained in the underwater demolition, clear the beaches. A matter of fact, the the UDT teams, when the Marines land, the UDT teams are on the beach so they won't drown. That's why they're there. You got all these 17, 18, 19-year-old boys with more weight on them that any man ought to be trying to carry, and then they throw them off in the ocean and expect them to survive. So the UDT teams are there to be out in the water if they need to be and get these guys up and going and get them on the beach. Well, during the Kennedy administration, him being a left-wing, kind of a communist kind of guy, I know people disagree with me, and I know I can hear some of you out there. He even announced he was against communism because he didn't have any choice as senator. But as soon as he got to be president, he was supporting the communists, and the left loves assassination. And so he's the one that gave the SEAL teams their start. He wanted a private assassination team, and that's what they've been ever since. Are they men that follow orders? Yes. Are they well trained? Yes. Are they tough? Yes. Are they loyal? Yes. I'm talking politics here. I'm not talking about the loyalty of our troops. I'm talking about what the evil empire does with our military. That's what I'm talking about. The UDT teams are very important, but now it's morphed into the SEAL teams. You don't hear about the UDT teams anymore, but the UDT teams are an important part of our armed forces. Matter of fact, we need them. We got to have them. It wouldn't work without them. And in World War II, we got real good at those beach landings, as you know. Well, we need to guard against all that. We're talking here about the power of the President of the United States. Our Constitution gives the President of the United States power to enforce the laws of the United States. That's the whole point. Not to enforce the laws of your state. And he has a lot of people under his command. Now, these two jurisdictions of the state and the federal government are different. And because of that, the President of the United States has the power to pardon only offenses against the United States. He does not have the power to pardon offenses against any of the states. So the state law crimes that you have, burglary, conspiracy, murder, and somebody gets convicted in a state court in your state, thrown in state prison, the President of the United States has absolutely zip, zilch, and zero authority to pardon any of those people. Your governor has authority to pardon them, and since we're a common law country, the governors in the states can do that according to the way they set it up in your state. Or set a reprieve, in other words, prolong the punishment that has been announced. Put a moratorium on it. You've heard me talk about George Ryan in Illinois. He put a moratorium on the death penalty. They were sending the boys of color out on the south side of Chicago to the electric chair like an assembly line. Old gangbangers or other people too. I know one fella. I've known him for years. He was outside of I think it was what they called it, the Thomas. It was the project of Uncle Lyndon Johnson back in the 60s to get rid of all poverty. So he thought he'd build massive, and did, with government money, massive apartment buildings on the south side of Chicago. I think they were called the Taylor buildings. I forget why they called them. We're talking thousands upon thousands of apartments. Beautiful high-rise buildings. It wasn't 10 years. They were ruined. Filled full of people who lived there for nothing. On the south side, they were ruined. Of course, the gangbangers took over. I talked to one fella, told me, he said, we had the walls of those apartment buildings tunneled we could go near anywhere in that building we wanted, just going through the walls and hide from the police. Well, I knew one young kid that he's a man now, he's up 50-some years old, but he was sitting outside of one of those apartment buildings out in the hall, sitting outside the door. Police came, found him. He was just sitting there. I don't know why. He was just a young teenage kid, found him, accused him of murder, and convicted him. He was on death row. Then they appealed, then they tried him again, hung the jury. He wasn't guilty of anything, nothing. Just a kid sitting outside. Well, he'd probably been doing things he hadn't ought to do because he was in that world. But well, that's they call it. They used to call it. You get picked up by the police. I'd heard them talk about it. They called it DWB. DWB. Well, you've heard of DUI, driving under the influence. This was DWB, driving while black. They just pick you up. You look like somebody that's committed a crime. We heard there was one around here. They'd run him into jail. They'd go to prison for 10, 20 years, or I've heard a lot of stories like that. Well, so George Ryan said this is getting out of hand. So he put a moratorium on the death penalty. Well, that was a reprieve of the governor of people convicted of state crimes. Well, the pardon. What's a pardon? The pardon is part of our common law tradition, and it's based upon the Christian doctrine of the new birth. Let me say that again. This is never said. I mean, who cares? I suppose people, if I talk about that, they'll think that I'm some kind of a religious nut. Well, no, that's not it. It's really the truth. The pardon is based upon the Christian doctrine of John chapter 3, the new birth. It's been around not for centuries, but for a couple thousand years just in the English-speaking world. It's part of our common law tradition. It does not exist anywhere else. Now, watch me close. When the governor of your state pardons somebody of a crime, or the president of the United States pardons somebody, such as he did hundreds of people apparently that have been jailed for years because of the January 6th event that really happened. And he pardoned them, and he pardoned a lot of other people too. A pardon does not, watch me, because it's based upon the Christian tradition of the new birth, a pardon does not exonerate anybody of the crime they were convicted of. Put it another way, a presidential pardon or a pardon of the governor of the state does not declare the man pardoned, does not declare him innocent at all. What does it do? It brings you into the world, as it were, the new birth, a new creature. If you don't understand that, you don't get to grasp what common law pardon is, and it's ancient, again, the doctrine goes back about 1,500 years in our Anglo-Saxon tradition, and then of law and government, that's the one we have here in America, and then gets lost in the fog of antiquity, and then it arises, you see it again in the Bible. But the connection is there. When the president of the United States or the governor of your state pardons somebody, they're not declaring them innocent of the crime they've committed. No, they're giving them a new start as a new person. In the old country, when the king declared, well, two ways he could declare a pardon. If a man is convicted of a crime by a 12-man jury, according to the course of our common law, if that happens, well, then the only way that can be undone, according to our common law, is by a pardon. There is no other way. No way available except pardon. You, my friend, read the book of Romans. Paul, acting as the prosecuting attorney, convicts every member of Adam's race of capital offenses called sin. Anything that is contrary in thought or deed to the mind and will and law of our God is a capital offense. That's why the Bible says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Now, that means you're bound for eternal hell. Now, that's what the Bible says. Now, how do you get out of that? Is there a way out according to the Bible, the Christian arrangement? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Is there a way out of a life sentence or an execution if you're convicted of a capital crime in our common law tradition? The answer is yes. It's called the pardon. The Bible doesn't use that word because it's not in the Greek or Hebrew tongue, the tongues through which the Bible was written. But it's the same doctrine. When you receive the new birth, and I'm just repeating what Paul says about it in his epistles. When you receive the new birth, everything is new. Why? You're a new person. You are not the old person you were before. No. You're not reformed. You're not the same person cleaned up and reformed. No. You're not even the other person at all. Is not the other person you were, according to the Bible, is not worth salvaging. In the flesh, your flesh is gone. You're born of the Spirit. And now the Spirit is in control of your flesh. If you'll discipline you, well, you do. God will discipline you to it. The Spirit born in you is eternal, and it cannot, listen to me, I'm quoting 1 John, it cannot sin. It's not that it won't. What is born in you is pure, from a pure seed, the word of God, according to Peter, and you cannot sin. That cannot sin. Well, then where's sin come from? We got this untrained, this out of control flesh you're still toting around. Before the new birth, you're dead in trespasses and sins. There's nothing there to salvage. You're dead. Spiritually dead, but the body is still kicking. And it's doing things, and your brain's thinking things it hadn't ought to think, and doing things you hadn't ought to do. The new birth is in you. The Spirit, by the seed, the sperma, that's where we get our word sperm. And that's the Greek word for seed in the New Testament, written in Greek. The seed of the Word of God births that in you. It's pure, and it's getting stronger inside of you. The flesh is getting older, weaker, but what is inside is getting stronger. Again, to say that the new birth is not about reformation or reforming somebody. That's impossible. The whole prison system is an impossible pipe dream, a fantasy. We're going to send that boy to reformatory school and reform him. Well, it may last a while, but that didn't work. Well, you can't reform this flesh. No, it's tainted. That's why the new birth, God says, is the way out of hell. So it is with the pardon. When the President of the United States in the old days, when the king pardoned an outlaw, that's somebody declared outside the protection of the law, or pardoned a convicted man of a crime. When he did that, the person, this is our common law tradition, just like in the Bible, what you have, it does not declare you innocent. It sets you anew, and everything that was old is gone. In England, in the old days, this is where it comes from. Let's say that you were a noble of noble birth. You owned and you had the rights to thousands of acres of land. You were fabulously wealthy. Then you get convicted of treason. This happened a lot in England. And treason, yeah, rebelling against the king or something. And then you were sentenced to death by drawing and quartering. Well, if that king died and another one came along, maybe, or even that king, he could decide to pardon you. But when he pardoned you, you entered the world. It wasn't a declaration of your innocence. You entered the world as a newborn babe, and all that land you owned, you don't own it anymore. If you had an academic doctor's degree from Harvard University, you didn't have that anymore. You didn't have nothing that you had of any value in the former life. You were starting clean, starting new, starting fresh. That's the new birth of the Christian religion. You start clean, you start new, fresh. So what does Paul say? Behold, all things are passed away when I became born from above, and behold, all things are new. I am a new, spanking, brand new creature, a new creation as a Christian, man or woman. That's our common law pardon, and it's an analogy to our Christian tradition. In this day of man's administration of governments, and that's where we are according to the Bible, according to Paul's epistles to the Corinthians, we are in a new day, a day of man's administration of government, called the day of man. We're awaiting the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a theme of the Bible through the prophets into the New Testament. That's the day of God's judgment, God's administration of government. Right now, we're in the day of man's, and we have been given that responsibility. And because we're a common law country, we have this thing called pardon. There's nothing like it in the rest of the world. So much for pardons. And of course, in that is also the doctrine of outlawry. The only way out of outlawry, once you're duly declared an outlaw, the only way out is by pardon. But really, again, pardon doesn't exonerate anybody. It's the power of the executive to declare you a new creature. It does not declare you innocent of your past deeds. Well, that's the fundamentals of pardon. And it took me a long time to dig that out. Matter of fact, it came over a period of years of research. Well, I just have to find out where to go to look for the answers, I guess, what it boils down to. But that's what it is. But it plays out. Our common law tradition plays out just like our Bibles. What other powers does the president have? What other powers does the president have? He has the very solemn power of making treaties for the United States with other nations. The solemn power of making treaties for the United States with other nations. Question 221. Why is this so solemn a power? Answer. Because a treaty is the supreme law of the land and usually concerns matters of great importance to all. The Constitution of the United States says that treaties have the equal dignity and force of laws that Congress makes. Now remember, the president has this power to make the treaty, but the treaty is not in force until the Senate of the United States ratifies it. So there's a check on the power of the President of the United States. There are many checks, that's just one of them. Well, let's get to question 222. Is nobody joined with the President in this power to make treaties, or may he make any agreement he thinks fit with other nations? Answer: this power is so great and weighty that the Constitution will entrust it to no one man. Even the President cannot make a treaty without the consent of the Senate of the United States. Nor is it sufficient that a majority of the Senate agree to it. 2/3 of all senators who are present when the vote is taken must agree to any treaty before it is binding on the United States. Let me read that again. 2/3 of all the senators who are present when the vote is taken must agree to any treaty before it is binding on the United States. Well, as the President of the United States stuck to this standard and made sure that treaties are duly ratified by the Senate of the United States by 2/3 of all members present before he begins to execute and enforce a treaty? And the answer is no, he hadn't followed that. I remember watching these fellows sitting in the White House. I don't even know if they're president. Biden, Obama. What proof do we have they were elected? With Obama, we don't have any. Neither with Biden. I'm not persuaded by any evidence that of any reliability that Obama was elected president of the United States. And even I feel even more like that concerning Biden. Clearly, he was not elected. Clearly, he was not elected. But he was in that position, and both of those fellows made a lot of agreements with other countries that the Senate of the United States did not ratify. Well, when that happens, who can enforce these provisions of our Constitution? If a president decides to make a treaty with China, well, let's take, for example, we had a general in charge of armed forces he was a general officer, charge armed forces. I forget the fellow's name, but he's the one that called his equivalent in rank and power, the general of the armed forces of China, and said, look, if Trump decides to take military action against China, I'll call you in advance. That man should be court-martialed, and whatever court-martial allows should be done to him. He's under the code. He's under martial law. He's a military officer. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. These guys way up at the top like that. Do you really think they know what they're doing? Do you really think they're fitted to the job? Do you really think that they're qualified? And the answer is no, no, no. In most all cases, not all. But in most all cases, there's a whole lot to be desired. In that case, this fella, whatever his name was, he didn't understand, or if he understood it, he wasn't willing to follow fundamental first principles of law. And when I say that he ought to suffer the consequences of court martial for doing that, I know that I learned the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I learned a lot about it, had to pass the test. What I remember is it was easy to pass the test because in every case, no matter what the offense was or is, if you just say that the consequence is by death or as a court martial may direct, you pass the test because that's the way military martial law is. It's usually by death, whatever you do. I mean, you get caught sleeping on watch if you're a young sailor or a soldier. Well, what's the penalty under the UCMJ martial law? Death. or as a court-martial may direct. Doesn't always happen that way. I'm just making the point. Whatever ought to be done with a fellow like that would not even try to hide that he's calling the commander of the armed forces of a communist country who's threatened us on several occasions and say, look, don't worry, he's not all there. He's 2 bricks shy of a load. I don't know how he got elected president. I know he's supposed to be my commander in chief, but I'll let you know beforehand so you guys can brace yourselves and get ready. You know what that could spell? An ignorant. What kind of a word can you use for a man like that? If he did that in real life and it happened, that could have spelt the destruction of not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of our armed forces, not to mention the possibility in such cases of utter defeat and having been conquered by that foreign power. Friends, we're in a position now, and probably always are, no sense being excited about it now, where we're on the edge of losing everything. And why? What is the answer to that problem? Well, you and I need to do something about it. Well, what can we do? I'll tell you what we can do. When the President of the United States says he's going to enforce his agreements with other countries and doesn't seek the ratification of the Senate before doing so by 2/3 of the votes of all those present, well, then it's our job to push for impeachment. How do we do that? We push our representatives, our senators, and our U.S. representatives. We certainly don't allow that kind of scum back into office again. Now, what about this general officer that said he'd call the Chinese and let them know if Trump decided he was going to take military action against them? What ought to be done in that case? What can we do? Well, I know this sounds, we got to think long term, friends, and that's what we're not doing. We got to think long term. We have to raise a crop and teach a crop of Americans that know the law of the land and mean to observe it well, because if we do that, then when people are old enough to become part of government, they can actually know what the truth is and maybe not destroy our country. That's what we're lacking now. We've got a Supreme Court, well, I don't know, I'm going to call her a Supreme Court justice. She's sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court writing opinions. She's so far out of bounds, a Biden appointee, so insanely crazy that the other liberal left-wing females, not the males, the females on the court are going after. And they're wacko themselves. Well, why don't the men go after? I'll tell you why. Let's just say the truth here. I'm not getting paid to be here. I'm not a highly paid radio, internet personality. For whatever reason, I'm really kind of glad now. I've been on the radio and the internet for many years. And if I ever did get to be popular, I got canned or thrown off. Why? Competition, envy, and jealousy, all those kinds of things. I'm just giving you the facts. You know, people like Rush Limbaugh and Hannity, fellows like that. What's the difference between them and Alex Jones? Not much. Well, you say, well, it looks like a lot to me. Well, the foundation, look closer. Real close. And I'm glad they're all saying what they're saying. But there are some subjects they will not touch. Because if they did, an overwhelming power would annihilate them and get them off the air. People like that are made famous. They're not because people just love them. They're made famous. Best-selling books aren't best-selling books because they're good books. They may be or they may not be. They're made famous because somebody made them that way. Billy Graham wasn't called America's preacher and famous like he was because he was doing the right things and people loved him. No, not at all. He was famous because the most powerful media Mongol in America sent out a telegram to his 300 newspaper outlets in 1949 with 2 words, said pump Graham. Pump Graham. Well, not glad he did. I'm just making the point. Billy Graham didn't do that. He was unknown. An unknown graduate of Wheaton College up in Chicago. And the more the media pumped Graham, the more popular he became. Now people can reach a point where they are doing pretty well and all that, but to be fabulously famous, those in charge of making people popular have to get on board. Recently, bring up another point here, Miss Francine. A subject I know a little bit of something about, and people say, well, Brent, you think you know something about everything. Well, there's some truth in that. I know I don't know everything, but I do know something about everything. But once you learn some fundamentals, you can apply them to everything, and you kind of know what's going on. You see, once you learn the truth, my friends, listen to me. Once you learn it quite a bit, you'll never know it all. But once you really focus on the truth, and you're not distracted by all the political baloney and all the fantasia out there and all the promotions, it's been a few decades that way. Studying the real article, when the false article pops up, you recognize it just like that. I'm not saying I do. I got fooled here recently. Oh boy, did I get fooled. You think you know a guy type thing. Oh boy, I've known him for 25 years, known the family, went places with him, traveled with him, did cases with him. Then you find out what they really believe. It's all right. I get better all the time. Like the one fella said, how is it, they're asking this guy who was wise, that knew what to do in a lot of cases, how is it that you always know what to do in whatever they were doing, military life or whatever? I don't remember. I heard this from somebody else. It's a famous quote, actually, from a famous man that I just remember his name. But he said, how do you have so many good experiences? And he said, by having a whole lot of bad experiences. That's the way I have good experiences, by having had a whole lot of bad experiences. And if you don't have some bad experiences, you go through life, you have a lot at first. Hopefully you'll have less and less, but you still need to have some sometimes. You get to thinking you're pretty smart, like you got things figured out. Plus, you need to learn some more anyway. Well, I'm still having bad experiences because of poor judgment. That's what I'm saying. But I sure have a whole lot less than I used to. That's right. Well, here 3-4 days ago, the world's most popular, you're thinking, what's he going to say? No question. The world's most popular Bible expositor, the world's most well-known, yes, the world's most well-known Bible expositor passed away. Now that's a very narrow area, a Bible expositor. I didn't say Bible teacher. I said Bible expositor. That's different. Passed away. What's a Bible expositor? Well, it's a clergyman that practices expository preaching. Says on this cup, you see that? You don't know Jack. You don't know Jack. Who's Jack? I know what some of you are thinking. You're putting that other word in there that we hadn't ought to be saying in polite company. Well, that's not where that came from. That wasn't the way it originally started. If you didn't know Jack, I've been there, I lived there. I lived in the place where if you didn't know Jack, you couldn't do nothing. I lived there better than 10 years, and I was there off and on, probably more like 25 or 30. I know the place well. If you didn't know Jack in this town, you were sunk. Well, where was the town, Brent? Well, it was in California. A place called Grass Valley, right by Nevada City. And if you don't know Jack in Grass Valley, not so much Nevada City, but Grass Valley. I was there decades ago. If you didn't know Jack, you couldn't get nothing done, and you wouldn't mount to anything. Who's Jack? Boy, and this went on for, well, let's see, about 100 years. You say, well, Jack didn't live that long. No, he didn't, but him and his cousins did. They were all there, and the family just kept going. What was it? Well, it was the Cornish miners. They shipped in those Cornish hard rock miners from the tin binders, they call them in Britain, from the tin fields of Cornwall. Those fellows have been mining hard rock, mining for tin for thousands of years. The Roman Empire got its tin. Oh, they got some from Spain. They got more from Cornwall. I mean, generation after generation for 40 generations, that's all those folk knew. So they shipped them to America. They said, we got a hard rock mine here making gold. You boys come over here. You know how to pump the water out of mines. You know how to stay alive in a mine. You know how you know the terminology of hard rock mining. So they shipped them over to Grass Valley, with the largest underground coal mine in the United States, the Empire Mine at Grass Valley, California. I've been there, been down there. Oh, I haven't been. Well, I've been all over around there. I've seen things at that mine before the state took it over. Then it's just ruined. Terrible. That's where President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, got his start working. He was a mining engineer at the Grass Valley Empire Mine. Well, those Cornishmen were there, and for some reason, they liked the name Jack. I don't know why, but the saying around there was, when I first started going back up in there in the mid 70s, the saying was, somebody would say, well, the full saying was, you don't know Cousin Jack. You don't know Cousin Jack. Well, if you didn't know Cousin Jack and one of those Cornishmen, there wasn't much you could do. And in time, they just kept proliferating like rabbits. Pretty soon, they took over the whole community, ran all the businesses, not to mention the coal mine or the gold mine. If you didn't know Jack, you didn't know nobody around there. That's really where that came from. And by the way, this cup came from Grass Valley, California, when I was there. Somebody was selling it. You don't know Jack. Of course, they got a Jack Terrier there. I don't know where they come. Are they from Cornwall? I don't know. Well, those Cornishmen were known for a couple of things. One of them was singing. They were like the Welshmen. They sang, and when they'd get on that car on that rail to go down in the mine, they'd sing hymns, Christian hymns. And that's where they really get good at it, learning how to sing, like those Welsh miners in Wales. They sang Christian hymns. And they'd always sing together. When they were together, they'd sing. Trying to think of the name of the famous movie about that. John Ford was the director back in the late 1940s. Maureen O'Hara, who became famous later with John Wayne, she starred in it. How Green Is My Valley. How Green Is My Valley. That's when they used to make movies that were, well, true to life and got across good lessons. But it was about these Welshmen, how they sang Miss Francine, if we play that song again, now the song they sang in the movie altogether as they were coming up out of the mines and walking down the street, every one of them stopped at their own house down the street in that little village, was the song we sang, where we play from Wales. It's kind of the unofficial national anthem. We ought to play that song again. We have it in two versions, Miss Francine. You remember the one version, the fellows are at the soccer game there in Wales, and they just start singing in the crowd and all get together and sing that hymn. We've got it in a few other places too, but maybe we can play that in a little bit. Well, what were we talking about?